Hey guys, what's up? This is Alex Duque. Welcome back with another cool and simple tutorial. Today we're talking about render layers. For those of you who do not know, render layers is a technique that you apply when you need to break up one render into its individual pieces. For those of you who are thinking that it's about speeding up render times, yeah, that's not always the case. Yes, sometimes you can, and if you know how to use them, you may be able to speed up a little bit of render times, but that's not necessarily the purpose of render layers. The main purpose of render layers is control. So, render layers, don't you just love my incredible typing? Render layers equals control. That's really the main thing about render layers. You don't always need to have a lot of render layers, but let me just write out like the main ones. You know, you have a shadow pass. That's the type of pass as far as render layers go. Shadow. You have reflection. You have, sorry about my typos. You have shadows. You have reflections. You have specular. You have shadows, reflection, specular. The main one, which is a beauty pass. A beauty pass is pretty much when you, I wonder if I can erase. Nope. A beauty pass is when you have all the different elements together. So like a regular render, anytime you make like a regular render, you're really making a beauty pass. So you got shadows, reflections, you have specular, you have diffuse, which is just the color information. You have some that are more advanced, which are called ID passes. You have, those are like RGB renders. You have matte passes, which are like masks. So like say you have a character that's walking from here to there on the screen, right? And that character goes over this thing that's in front of him. And this thing that's in front of him is a CG element. Or it could be, let's say it's a real element and you have this CG guy. So you can either make a mask, a 2D mask in Photoshop, or you can make a CG element that maps out the character, the 3D character. So anyway, sorry if you don't understand my writing. Sometimes even I don't understand it. So anyway, those are some of the main things about render passes and render layers. One of the most common use of render layers, just write out one more thing here, is what's called a foreground, middle ground, and background. Sometimes you're in a floor, a ground floor. Those can be some or a character. Those are like main passes, you know, and even on the foreground pass you can have all those little passes, and the middle ground you can have all those, the background, so on and so forth. So you can really break it down. But like I said, the main reason why you break it down into all these contribution passes or these little other passes is for control. Like if you need to make the shadows sharper, or if you need to make them softer, or you know, more transparent or more blue for color correction purposes. So those are like the main things here. But we're not going to get that in depth. We're going to keep it simple. So we're going to do a little exercise with footage, because that's really one good place to explain this. So here's Maya. So I got my project already set. I'm just going to go ahead and create a new camera. And let's just look through that camera and give it an image plane. And I'm going to load up this little picture I have here. It's a picture of Seagraph in Boston. I think it's 2007. That's not Seagraph, that's just a train station in there, but I think it's got a pretty standard lighting, so it's nothing like too insane or anything like that. So it's pretty good for this exercise, and it doesn't have like a massive perspective or anything like that. So setting up the camera is going to be a relatively quick process. So anyway, we got our camera. It's just at a ground plane. I'm just going to scale it up a little bit and just going to tie up the perspective just a tad bit. I'm not going to get too fancy on this unless I really have to. But all I'm trying to do here is just make a matching, just a very basic perspective matching. I'm going to give it less so you can see it better. You guys can see this better. So you can see that's my little ground plane there. Just do a smooth wireframe. And just lining it up right there. And if you see this edge, it's pretty much lined up right there, so it's nothing like insane, but like I said, you guys the point across, and for this exercise that's really all I need. So anyway, we got that. Let's just lock the camera here. And now that our camera is locked, let's go ahead and add a little CG element. Now, I'm not going to get anything fancy here. Just going to bring in a CG element like so, and this little guy is, let's animate it, right? We got the chance to animate with dynamics, why not? So let's just go ahead and go to the dynamics menu. Let's make this guy passive. Let's make this guy an active by giving it gravity. Let's change our magnitude to 980. So that he doesn't fall really slow. He's falling kind of fast, and just make sure our playback is set to every frame. And let's make it 9.8 meters. This is a relatively big object. Let's playback speed, maximum real time. That's too slow. Let's make it 98. See, I didn't set up my scale properly, so I just have to sort of like play it and see how well it's playing. Alrighty, let's twist this guy up a bit. And let's give him more mass. And let's take less bounciness, less concrete. Same thing here. Let's make this guy have less bounciness. Let's give this guy a tad bit more. Alright, let's just go ahead and make a little play blast just to make sure we're on the right track and things are not going to have a weird motion later, because that would really suck. You know, spending all this time and then the animation's off, it's like, what? Alrighty, so let me just go ahead and wait for this to open up. Yep, that's pretty good. Okay, so we got our motion. Let's just go ahead, File, Save Scene As, and we're going to call this Render Layer Setup. So, you know, the first thing you need, of course, are your geometries. And once your geometries are there, you have this footage as your background, so definitely using Mentor could be something you want to do. I'm just going to use camera 1 and just going to tie up the lighting. Rendering. So let's just tie that lighting to this a little bit. Oh, by the way, another render layer could be an occlusion layer. So I might do a little bit of that. I'm just looking at the direction of the shadow, so I see a shadow going back there on this footage, and I see some highlights mainly on this side. So I guess it's a fair bet to say that the lighting is coming somewhere around from this direction. It's just really soft. So I'm going to open up the attributes here and change my shadows to have ray trace shadows, and here really soft, maybe a 10-degree. That would be somewhere around like 60 rays. See how that turns out. Options, render settings. Of course, you gotta set up your render settings so that they're a little bit more accurate. I can do this on draft, but I'm gonna take it up a notch. Just gonna wait for it to load. Alright, production, render, camera 1. See what we're getting. I'm not looking for anything like uber spectacular, just very simple. Just increase the intensity of that light just a tad bit. 1.6, and make the color same color of that white surface. It's kind of greenish, so I'm just gonna. That's probably all right. It's really soft lighting. It's very indirect, so. Obbity kibbity. Nothing fancy, nothing uber complex. Just gonna add a bit of an ambience, and I can do that by having final gather. But because I'm gonna keep this tutorial a little simple, I am not, because if I do final gather, then that requires a little bit more setup when it comes to the render layers. So just gonna add an ambient light and give it a really low intensity, really low, maybe 0.1, and a bit of a color, an ambience color. It's going to come here and close. Let's see how that fits. It's going to brighten this up just a tad bit more. Just about right, and just change this color. I'm not gonna spend too much time because I sort of have to keep these tutorials pretty short, so bear with me if this does not look perfect. Okay, so once you have your lighting and once you have your camera set up, then comes the setting up the render layers. Like I said, there's a whole bunch of different types and techniques for render layers. Let's start with the most simple. You can access the render layers by going into the render layer tab, which is right here. And whenever you select an object, and you have these icons here. So the first one, which is this little blue surface thing, will create a new render layer and will add whatever you have selected onto that render layer, and that is what it's going to render. So if I do that, then that's what's going to render. Except that right now I didn't add the light. So maybe I need to come back here, select light, come back there, and now rather than making a new render layer, because then that would just give me a new render layer with just the light, just delete this layer. What you can do is, while standing on that new render layer with the object selected, you can right click, add selected objects, and that will add whatever you have selected onto that render layer. Now if you double click on the word, you can change the name. Let's call this ground. And if you make a render while standing on that render layer, then it will render that render layer, like so. Now, let's go back here. Then let's suppose that's one render layer, and back on the master, let's select the light and the cube and make a new render layer, and that will add those two, and then we can call this cube. And this is when the techniques begin to get a little hectic, because now if I render the cube, it'll render my cube, of course, with the lighting. I did not add the ambient light, so let me just go ahead and add that, and add it here as well. So that's my ground, which has the ground only, and that's the cube, which has the cube only, like so. Right, so while standing on the cube layer, you can see what happens. Now we have this broken down, and it's kind of cool, and what Maya allows for is a little thing called, like, I don't even know if it's going to name, but you can preview the compositing, so you don't have to, stay going back and forth in After Effects and Maya to see your compositing. You can do a little checkup of how all the compositing happens within Maya itself. You can do that by going into the render window, and on the render window, go into render all layers. So once you have that, it'll have a little check mark, and that means it'll render all layers. And if you go to the option box, you've got a couple of options there. You can either composite the layers, composite and keep the layers, or keep the layers. So if I do, let's say, composite and keep the layers, and just to show you an example, by the way, this X means it's not going to render. So I'm going to make a little render, and it'll render the ground, and then it'll render the cube, and then it'll put them together, like so. So as you can see, you're like, hey, wait, what? Isn't it supposed to compose the cube on top of the ground? So, if that's what's happening, why is there no ground on the final comp? That's because of that image plane. So you can actually disconnect the image plane or set what's called a render layer override. So for example, while on the cube layer, I can display mode. If you right click on any or most attributes, you can right click and you'll see an option that says create layer override. And what that will do is whatever change I make right now for that attribute while on this layer will happen only for this layer. So I'll do none. And if I come to the ground is showing the RGBA, but cube is not. So it's you can do, that's what's called a render layer override. And those overrides are pretty handy because you can make a change only for that layer and it won't affect any other layer. So you can think of these render layers as files. Like it's like having a whole bunch of files, of Maya files in one main file. Alright, so cube, so let's try that again. So we kept all those images, so I'm just going to remove those images from the render window and try this one more time. So it's going to render layer 1, which is the ground, and then it'll render layer 2, which is the cube, and then it'll put them together, like so. And voila, so we have a ground, we have a cube, and we have A and B together. And you're like, oh cool, it's starting to make sense, but where's the shadow? Because remember, if I go to the master layer and let me just take off this render layers. If I go to the master layer and make a render, it actually has shadows on it. And when it's composite, it's not showing those shadows. That's when things start getting tricky. So think about this. On the ground, you need to see the shadows of the cube being casted onto the ground. However, you don't want the cube itself to be rendering on the ground. I hope that makes sense. Well, how do you go about this? Well, you can add the cube onto the ground so that it casts shadows. So I'm on the ground and I'm just going to make a little render right there. That render layer is off. Just going to make a render while on the ground, and it's going to render the ground, it's going to render the cube and the shadow. And you're like, yeah, that's fine, but I don't want the cube. You can remove the cube by, there's a lot of ways, but one of them is to tell it to not be renderable. So if you open up the attributes for the cube, under the cube shape, under the render stats, you'll see an option that says primary visibility. There you'll see a whole bunch of render styles. You got cast shadows, receive shadows, motion blur, primary visibility, visible in reflections, visible in refractions. And you can see, like in this case, I didn't have to create a layer override because, like I said, some are automated and some you have to make them yourself. Because this is something that's pretty common to do, Maya, Autodesk has sort of like, you know, made it easy on you, so you don't have to create a layer override. You can just click it. Okay, so primary visibility off. That means it's still going to cast shadows. It's still going to receive shadows. It will be visible in reflections and refractions, but as far as being visible itself, nope, that's not going to happen. So if you make a render, then we're going to see the ground and the shadows, and voila, that's cool. Now the cube by itself would just be the cube, so that's the alpha of the cube, and of course render all layers will now render the ground with the shadows, the cube, and put them together. Like I said, this very basic compositing here happening in Maya. You got A, B, and voila, you got them together, cube, ground. So far so good, except that we're supposed to see, as far as an alpha goes, we're supposed to see only the shadow. On the ground layer, you know, all that ground has to be transparent except the shadow, which needs to be solid. That way, when we make the render, you know, you actually see the footage behind. You don't see this little weird looking thing. So, what can we do to fix that? Well, there is a specialty shader. It's like a compositing shader, if you want to call it. It's called a used background. A used background shader will use whatever you have in the background as sort of like the shading for it, and you can it'll be alpha. Like all this stuff, that will be alpha. But you know, as far as reflectivity, for example, if it's reflective, that will not have alpha. That will be solid. Or in the case of shadows, then the shadows will be solid. So because we're talking about shadows only, we don't need specularity, we don't need reflectivity, we definitely don't need any reflection limits. This 3 will make, by being 0, 0, 0, will make this used background be sort of like a shadow receiver shader, if you want to call it. So we're going to create it, there we go, and just going to, while on the ground layer, I'm going to assign it to the floor. So now, take off this render all layers. So now, let me just remove a couple of render layers here. Out, out, out. I'm going to keep that one. Out and out. Okay, so this is what we were having in the ground layer. And now that we're using the used background on the ground layer, by the way, it looks green, or unless you press 6, it looks black. If I make a render right now of this render layer, what do you know? So as you can see, everything is alpha wherever that ground plane is, and it's receiving those shadows. So it's pretty handy. Now we are using the footage just for reference purposes, but that footage shouldn't actually render, because that footage is something that you'll have in the compositing, you know, in After Effects, where you have your footage and then you have the independent renders of just the ground shadow pass and just the cube pass. So what we're going to do is we're just going to come here to the ground and do the same layer override here and just take it to none. So now the ground, when I render it, it'll look black. It's like, wait, where's everything? It's on the alpha, okay? That's because that's what that used background shader does. And here's a cube. So I'm just gonna make a little render of a little batch render. So let's go ahead and rendering, render, settings, so common, we'll call this, oh actually this is actually pretty handy for render layers. If you right click on the file name prefix, you have all these presets. I love this one, insert layer name. What that will do is it'll render the file with the name of the render layer. So it's actually pretty handy because you don't want to have a whole bunch of files with the same name and you're like, wait, which one's the ground and which one's the cube? So if you do that render layer and you name these guys correctly, you know which one's which. So name number the extension 1 to 90 by frame 1. Frame padding it's 2, 0, 1 to 90. Renderable camera 1, and 640 by 480. You know, we're not gonna get anything fancy here, and that is pretty much it. So file, save scene, and I'm going to send this render and catch you in a little bit. Hey guys, welcome back. Okay, render is done, so let me just drag this window in here. As you know, the images get rendered into images. Right now it just made a whole bunch of sequence, so I'm just going to organize this a little bit. Just make a new folder here. I'm going to call this ground, and another folder called cube. So cube will go under cube, and of course ground will go under ground. Not underground, because then nobody will see it. Just under the folder. Ovrview, here we go. So nice and organized. So we got images. Now personally I have a particular setup. Just have a folder. I already made it because I have some other assets in here. It's called compositing assets. So I'm just going to put in those two folders under compositing assets. I'm just going to make a new folder. Call this simple render layers, and I'm going to put these two guys in there and put that under compositing assets. There we go. So under compositing assets I got my simple render layers. So with that there said and done, let's go file in After Effects. By the way, I already have After Effects opened. Just going to go ahead and file import, and going to select my simple render layers. And this is a cool trick. If you just select the group, oh never mind, open. Now that's going to ask me if I want to do straight or pre-multiplied. Sometimes straight works, but not always. Anytime you have CG footage, especially if your background's black, it's best to pre-multiply with black. That will allow for fringing to be removed. I'm going to keep it as straight so you guys can see what I'm talking about. And here's the nifty trick I was talking about. If I actually come here into simple render layers and I drag my ground layer, my ground folder, into the project panel, it's going to import the whole sequence. So that's pretty handy. And here's another one. If I drag and drop this onto make a new comp icon or into the timeline, it'll make a new project with the correct settings and length. So it's pretty handy. Now this looks black, but if you look at the alpha, it's actually perfecto. And here we go into cube. I'm just going to drag my cube here on top. So here's my cube, and there's my ground, and it falls. Alrighty, let's take this off. Okay, now I'm going to take off this background. I'm just going to make a new solid, and I'm just going to do this so you can see what I'm talking about as far as the fringing. So I'm just going to make the background white and put it underneath. And we just do a snapshot of this image right here, and it doesn't have that much fringing, but let's see what happens. Interpret footage main, and take the settings to pre-multiplied. and you can see a little bit of the removal. I'm just going to compare both. See? So right now it's not too visible, but there are some cases when it is visible. So you want to pre-multiply the background to whatever background color you have. Let me just delete this white solid. Okay, so let's import our footage. And of course the footage is like a photo, so it's although it's got the right aspect, it's probably bigger than this comp that I have under source images. I'm just going to bring it in. I'm just going to put it under behind. And as you can see, it's bigger. I'm just going to scale it down. And that's what we're getting right off the bat. It's not so bad. However, like I said, render layers are about control. So now if I wanted to let's say make the ground more transparent, the ground shadow, then I can make it a little bit more transparent. See? Or if I wanted to color correct the ground shadow, I could color correct the ground shadow, or the cube. If I wanted to color correct the cube, I can do that individually. So that's really where the whole power of render layers come in. So let's just go color correction, let's do hue and saturation. So if I wanted to desat a little bit, change the brightness of it, and color correction, maybe a little bit of levels adjustments. Got that contrast. Change the hue a bit. Yeah, we're going to keep it simple, so just going to make a little preview there. And there we go. So I know I'm not making anything too complex, but that's the essence of it. You got a foreground and a background in this case, or a ground shadow. And that pretty much concludes this simple lesson. So I hope you learned a little bit, and I will see you next time with maybe some cubes or some balls or something. Alright guys, see you. Bye bye.